Okay, when I was reading the FATF 40 recommendations, I left off at recommendation number 11 on page 7, and it appears that I'm 1/3 of the way through these. Alright, recommendation number 11. Financial institutions should pay special attention to all complex, unusual, large transactions and all unusual patterns of transactions which have no apparent economic or visible lawful purpose. The background and purpose of such transactions should, as far as possible, be examined, the findings established in writing, and be available to help competent authorities and auditors. Recommendation 12. Customer due diligence and record-keeping requirements set out in Recommendations 5, 6, and 8 to 11 apply to designated non-financial businesses and professions in the following situations. We have casinos, real estate agents, dealers of precious metals and dealers in precious stones, lawyers, notaries, and independent legal professionals and accountants, trust and company service providers, and a little bit more specific information on casinos. The customer due diligence and record-keeping requirements apply to them when customers engage in financial transactions equal to or above the applicable designated threshold, which in America is $10,000 and abroad I believe is $15,000. Real estate agents, customer due diligence applies to them when they are involved in transactions for the client concerning the buying and selling of real estate. Dealers in precious metals and dealers in precious stones are required to do customer due diligence when they engage in any cash transaction with a customer equal to or above the applicable designated threshold, same threshold. Lawyers, notaries, and independent legal professionals and accountants when they prepare for or carry out transactions for their client concerning the following activities: buying and selling of real estate, managing of client money, securities, and other assets, management of bank savings or securities accounts, organization of contributions for the creation, operation, or management of companies, creation, operation, or management of legal persons or arrangements, and buying and selling of business entities. Trust and company service providers when they prepare for or carry out transactions for a client concerning the activities listed in the definition in the glossary. Recommendation 13, reporting of suspicious transactions and compliance. Let's see here. If a financial institution suspects or has reasonable grounds to suspect that funds are the proceeds of criminal activity or are related to terrorist financing, it should be required directly by law or regulation to report promptly its suspicions to the Financial Intelligence Unit. Recommendation number 14. Financial institutions, their directors and employees should A. be protected by legal provisions from criminal and civil liability for breach of any restriction on disclosure of information imposed by contract or by any legislative, regulatory, or administrative provision. If they report their suspicions in good faith to the FIU, even if they did not know precisely what the underlying criminal activity was, and regardless of whether illegal activity actually occurred. B. Financial institutions, their directors, officers, and employees should be prohibited by law from disclosing the fact that a suspicious transaction report or related information is being reported to the FIU. Recommendation 15, financial institutions should develop programs against money laundering and terrorist financing. These programs should include A, the development of internal policies procedures and controls, including appropriate compliance management arrangements and adequate screening procedures to ensure high standards when hiring employees. B, an ongoing employee training program. And C, an audit function to test the system. 16, the requirements set out recommendations 13 to 15 and 21 apply to all recommendations. All designated non-financial businesses and professions subject to the following qualifications. A, lawyers, notaries, and other independent legal professionals and accountants should be required to report suspicious transactions when, on behalf of or for the client, they engage in financial transaction in relation to activities described in recommendation 12D. Countries are strongly encouraged to extend the reporting requirements to the rest of the professional activities of accountants, including auditing. Dealers in precious metals and dealers in precious stones should be required to report suspicious transactions when they engage in any cash transaction with a customer equal to or above the applicable designated threshold. NC, trust and company service providers should be required to report suspicious transactions for a client when, on behalf of or for a client, they engage in a transaction in relation to the activities referred to in Recommendation 12E. Lawyers, notaries, and other independent legal professionals and accountants acting as independent legal professionals are not required to report their suspicions if the relevant information was obtained in circumstances where they are subject to professional secrecy or legal professional privilege, which is like all the time. Right? Alright. I hate having rosacea. Recommendation 17. Other measures to deter money laundering and terrorist financing. Countries should ensure that effective, proportionate, and dissuasive sanctions, whether criminal, civil, or administrative, are available to deal with natural or legal persons covered by these recommendations that fail to comply with anti-money laundering or terrorist financing requirements. 18. Countries should not approve the establishment or accept the continued operation of shell banks. Financial institutions should refuse to enter into or continue a correspondent banking relationship with shell banks. Financial institutions should also guard against establishing relations with respondent foreign financial institutions that permit their accounts to be used by shell banks. 19. Countries should consider the feasibility and utility of a system where banks and other financial institutions and intermediaries would report all domestic and international currency transactions above a fixed amount to the National Security Agency with a computerized database available to competent authorities for use in money laundering or terrorist financing cases, subject to strict safeguards to ensure proper use of the information. Recommendation 20. Financial institutions should give special attention to business relationships and transactions with persons, including companies and financial institutions. From countries which do not or insufficiently apply the FATF recommendations, whenever these transactions have no apparent economic or visible lawful purpose, their background or purpose should, as far as possible, be examined, the findings established in writing, and be available to help competent authorities. Where such a country continues not to apply or insufficiently applies the FATF recommendations, countries should be able to apply appropriate countermeasures. Recommendation 22. Financial institutions should ensure that the principles applicable to financial institutions which are mentioned above are also applied to branches and majorly owned subsidiaries located abroad, especially in countries which do not or insufficiently apply the FATF recommendations, to the extent that local applicable laws and regulations permit. When local applicable laws and regulations prohibit this implementation, competent authorities in the country of the parent institution should be informed by the financial institutions that they cannot apply the FATF recommendations. Regulation supervision. 23rd. Countries should ensure that financial institutions are subject to adequate regulation and supervision and are effectively implemented by FATF recommendations. Competent authorities should take the necessary legal and regulatory measures to prevent criminals or their associates from holding or being the beneficial owner of a significant or controlling interest in or holding a management function in a financial institution. For financial institutions subject to the core principles, the regulatory and supervisory measures that apply for prudential purposes and which are also relevant to money laundering should apply in a similar manner for anti-money laundering and terrorist financing purposes. Other financial institutions should be licensed or registered and appropriately regulated and subject to supervision and oversight for anti-money laundering purposes. Having regard to the risk of money laundering or terrorist financing in that sector. At a minimum, businesses providing a service of money or value transfer or of money or currency changing should be licensed or registered and subject to effective systems for monitoring and ensuring compliance with national requirements to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. Recommendation 24. Designated non-financial businesses and professions should be subject to regulatory and supervisory measures as set out below. A. Casinos should be subject to a comprehensive regulatory and supervisory regime that ensures that they have effectively implemented the necessary anti-money laundering and terrorist financing measures. At a minimum, casinos should be licensed. Competent authorities should take the necessary legal and regulatory measures to prevent criminals or their associates from holding or being the beneficial owner of a significant or controlling interest, holding a management function in or being an operator of a casino. And competent authorities should ensure that casinos are effectively supervised for compliance with recommendations to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. Countries should ensure that the other categories of designated non-financial businesses and professions are subject to effective systems for monitoring and ensuring their compliance with requirements to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. This should be performed on a risk-sensitive basis. This may be performed by a government authority or by an appropriate self-regulatory organization, provided that such an organization can ensure that its members comply with the obligations to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. Recommendation 25. The competent authorities should establish guidelines and provide feedback which will assist financial institutions and designate non-financial businesses and professions in applying national measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, and in particular in detecting and reporting suspicious transactions. C. Institutional. This is Part C. Institutional and other measures necessary in systems for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. Competent authorities, their powers and resources. Recommendation 26. Countries should establish a FIU that serves as a national center for the receiving and, as permitted, requesting, analysis and dissemination of STR and other information regarding potential money laundering or terrorist financing. The FIU should have access directly or indirectly on a timely basis to the financial, administrative, and law enforcement information that it requires to properly undertake its functions, including the analysis of an STR, which is like an SIR, but it's suspicious transaction reporting and not suspicious activity reporting. Recommendation 27. Countries should ensure that designated law enforcement authorities have responsibility for money laundering and terrorist financing investigations. Countries are encouraged to support and develop, as far as possible, special investigative techniques suitable for the investigation of money laundering, such as controlled delivery, undercover operations, and other relevant techniques. Countries are also encouraged to use other effective mechanisms, such as the use of permanent or temporary groups specialized in asset investigation and cooperative investigations with appropriate competent authorities in other countries.